Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Gio and Joey Show with a return and favorite guest, Dr. Jenniffer. How are you today?
I'm doing really well. Thank you.
Hey, Joey,
How about
yourself,
you?
how are you doing?
Yeah.
Better than I deserve.
All right, Joey, set us up and let us know about this book we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, so the topic, so this is from we're going to talk about the book by Louise Perry on the case against the sexual revolution. I'd read it a while ago, and then I saw Dr. Schwirzer posted something about it. So I'm like, okay, we got to have a conversation about it. But at least for me, and then I'll be really interested to see, where this conversation goes. But one of my main takeaways is there's something that the Baptist theologian Andrew Walker likes to say, that the natural law finds a way, right? In other words, people like we can try we try our ways and all sorts of things. We have our, and obviously this is a whole other topic, but like our transhumanism stuff, and like we think we can always do better than God's design. And yet at the end of the day, the natural law finds a way. God's order actually works. And what I found interesting too is the person who wrote the book that we're going to be discussing, she's not a Christian. She didn't come from a conservative perspective, and yet the conclusions she comes to could have been written by a Christian theologian, and have been actually. But
Mm-hmm. So, Dr. Jenniffer, how'd you come across the book? I know you read widely, but why? What piqued your interest in this book?
I don't even remember. I think it was a comment on one of my posts or something. Someone
Mm-hmm.
said you need to read this book. And I take book recommendations very seriously because there's so many books, so many things to read, so many podcasts to listen to. When someone recommends it to me who knows me, I take it very seriously. So I read a lot of the books that people recommend, and I read this one.
Okay. So, what was your first? Well, before you began reading it, I know it was recommended to you, but before you get reading it, what were some of your thoughts? Sometimes you read a title, the cover, something jumps out at you. What were you kind of hoping to get out of it?
Yeah, I have always seen feminism as a mixed bag. Of course, there are different waves of feminism. I hope we could talk briefly about that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's good stuff. I would say each wave had something redemptive, maybe not third wave, but first and second definitely had some good things about it. But then they had some negatives. And my observation of human nature is that we always overcorrect when we're trying to fix something, we overfix it.
Mm-hmm.
And there has been historic oppression of women. There's no doubt. In fact, I would say that God predicted it in his word,
Mm-hmm.
that it would come out as a result of the fall, because part of the fallen nature is might makes right. Well, whoever is strongest will exploit the weak. And so women are weaker
Mm-hmm.
physically. And as a result of physical comparative weakness, we have social weakness and financial weakness and all different layers of weakness. And because of that, they've women have been exploited and oppressed over the grand arc of history. And feminism attempted to correct some of that, but it corrected it in a human way
Mm-hmm.
that created additional problems, is the way I would put it.
Yeah, yeah. And like you said, the enemy doesn't care what ditch you fall in, and humans don't know how to live in that perfect tension. And
Mm-hmm.
so we go from one extreme to the other extreme, not realizing that a certain amount of tension is actually good for the soul to keep one balanced between mercy and justice. So, what was your first impression after reading the book?
Well, let me tell you what my first impression was when I first started reading the book.
Mm-hmm.
I thought she was just wandering around. I don't know what it was about her writing, but I didn't like the beginning of the book. I just felt like she was just blathering on and kind of consciousness, because she didn't do a great job, I would say, of saying what she was going to say and then say it and then say what she
Mm-hmm.
said,
Yeah.
just kind of basic to structuring any kind of message. But other than that, I kept reading, and I'm glad I did, and found that what she wrote was incredibly profound, extremely well researched, and very well thought out, very well logically reasoned through
Mm-hmm.
in ways that are way beyond. I mean, she's a young woman. I was really kind of astonished that someone with as little life experience as she's had, and being millennial, I believe,
Hmm.
surrounded with peers for which the things to whom which the things that she was saying were anathema, that she had the social courage to say those things, and that she had the intelligence to articulate them as well as she did. And this sort of objectivity to be able to make the observations she made was really kind of remarkable. I don't know her
Hmm.
work very well except this book, but I was kind of astonished at the level of maturity that you can see in the
Oh,
research and in the way she articulated it.
Joey, your thoughts? You read the book when you first started reading it.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. He's
You're on mute, knucklehead.
Right. No. First of all, that was a good assessment, and I agreed with that. One thing that did stuck out to me when reading the book and then listening to her is I actually think it I think the fact that a lot of younger people actually are coming to some of these conclusions. In other words, I think that when the sexual revolution was in full force, right? It's kind of like socialism, right? George Orwell was a socialist in the 30s, and I can forgive George Orwell because he didn't have the gulags to look at. He didn't have the whole history of Mao's revolution and all those things. And so the beginning generations that kind of came through the 60s and all that, like the idea, and to your point, right, there was a legitimate wrongs that they were trying to right, and so
Mhm.
these ideas maybe made sense. And yet I think people more on my side of the spectrum, more on Louise Perry's side of the spectrum, like we've seen that, like you look around and you got a society where the single motherhood rate is super high, fatherlessness is super high, people aren't actually happy, right? Like you can't, like, you know what I mean? Like we can watch movies of like people, like, obviously, we're Adventists here, so we don't drink, but like going to a bar or going to a real place and like meeting someone, and like like those dynamics, that's not the dynamics of our society. Sorry.
Hmm.
So I feel like being at the end of the revolution, it's easier to see the wreckage. I don't know. That just kind of stuck out to me.
And
Okay.
it's just not cool anymore. Like it's not, the peer pressure has been kind of interrupted by the fact that youth, in particular, young people want novelty. They want new things. And at this point, the sexual revolution, certain
It's
aspects of
stale.
feminism are exactly old hat.
Hmm. Hmm.
So they're more open to new things than you would be at the beginning of that process.
I know you have an article with you that you want to reference. What are
Yeah.
some of the things the article pointed out that you want the audience to know about?
I mean, they basically just summarized the book so well that I just thought I would just go off of it. So this
Hmm.
is an article called Review: The Case Against the Sexual Revolution by Louise Perry by a guy named Al Stewart, and it's on the Gospel Coalition website. And I thought it was just an excellent summary of what was great about the book, and then a little bit at the end about what was missing in the book. And basically, the summary is that Louise Perry exposes some very dark aspects of the sexual revolution. So I
Hmm.
kind of like to go through them
Yeah,
one by
let's go.
one.
Let's go.
Okay. So partly the way she got to where she
Hmm.
got was that she worked at a rape crisis center.
Hmm.
And of course, dealt with women who had been sexually violated, victims of sexual violence, and had a firsthand exposure to the various aspects of the sexual revolution and the dangers it brought into women's lives. So that's what kind of converted her, so to speak, from, she was a regular millennial. Let me just read this. As a younger woman, I held the same political opinions as most other millennial urban graduates of the West. In other words, I conformed to the beliefs of my class, including the liberal feminist ideas about porn, BDSM, hookup culture, evolutionary psychology, and the sex trade, which will all be addressed in the book. So she ends up addressing them pretty much one by one. But what kids of her age came out of university, these sophisticated universities doing such a great job of educating the next generation, is that all of those things were okay. BDSM, porn. There was no moral case for anything involving sexuality. You can't, you couldn't make an absolute moral case for it. And so she differs with it. So one of the first things that she addresses, she does like this sort of grand sweep of the sexual revolution, about 50 years of it. And then let me read a couple of the quotes. She
Yeah.
says, how can we best promote the well-being of both men and women? And I love this. I feel it's a very salient statement. How can we best promote the well-being of both men and women, given that these two groups have different sets of interests, which are sometimes in tension? And I love that because it's so true. And it really sort of highlights the fact that the post-fall world, in order to live in this post-fall world with post-fallen natures, there has to be sacrifice, or people self-destruct and they destroy others. So men and women have to sacrifice for one another to live in harmony with each other, because our interests are at odds with one another. And you can see God attempting to do that, in Genesis 3 after the fall, saying what the respective curses would be on woman and then man. And what he's trying to do is give them a way forward in this fallen world. Now that you're in the mess that you made, how can you go forward the best way possible? And he gives them this formula kind of, and she ends up basically arriving at the same place. So
Let me jump in here real quick. So, we mentioned about these secular universities, and I used to be a volunteer chaplain at Texas A&M, which is, considered a little bit more conservative based on some of these other public high-profile universities. And two things I want to mention there. One is that when I used to ride along with the police, between like 7 and midnight, it was always quiet. After midnight, when the alcohol was already down, all the sexual assault cases, everything would go up. Spike. And this hookup culture, spike, was all you mix alcohol with raging hormones, never a good thing. But that being said, right, that's secular universities, and the article talks about that. But I was at Southern twice, once converted and once unconverted. And even at our dear old Southern, you can find the hookup culture if you're looking for it. At Southern. So when I went unconverted, it was there. When I went back later in life, converted, obviously I didn't go looking for that, but that doesn't mean it disappeared. And so we, parents have to understand that these are things that even kids in our universities are wrestling with. They may put the front, they may look churchy, but we need to have these conversations with kids, because if we think that it's not happening at our schools, we got something else coming.
Another thing coming. It's a softer version of it. It's less flagrant, less brazen, and it's more regulated against by the school itself, but it doesn't mean it's not there. Yeah.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, one of the things she brings out in the book, she starts to talk about the differences between men and women. And one of the things she points out is that, and this was kind of shocking to me, 95 to 99% of convicted sex offenders are male. Like, one of the things that really irritates me about various forms of feminism is this idea that the only differences between males and females are the obvious anatomical differences. Mm-hmm. And this factors into the transgender discussion. Like, are you kidding me?
Yeah,
you're going to have
get me started
at this level and estrogen at this level in a male, and you can have the opposite ratio in a female, and there's not going to be any behavioral differences. Who are you trying to fool?
Mm-hmm.
But this is,
when you look at statistics of marriages between same sex, right? After several years, women marriages, the sex is gone. When you look at the male, I mean, it's so promiscuous, which is why we had the sexual STD pandemic in the 80s and 90s and continuing. It's just we have better medicine to keep it under the thing, but it really hasn't stopped. And it shows you the drives that are different. And that's
Yeah.
why I have
And
no.
ironically, you look at gay marriages, both lesbian and homosexual male
Hmm.
marriages, and you see the differences between males and females in a sort of magnified. Because what
Hmm.
happens in a heterosexual marriage is there's this blending.
Hmm.
And so the two become one, literally. And so the strong traits, the feminine traits, the masculine traits kind of mesh together and they balance each other out. But what happens in a marriage with two women, for example, is there's the divorce rate is off the charts
Yeah.
because heterosexual marriages, 70% of the divorces are filed by women.
Hmm.
And there's a good reason for that. Women are wired relationally. We are the gatekeepers of relationships. We are very good at judging what's wrong in a relationship and really being carefully tending to that. But if you have two women in a relationship, it's going to go off the charts. And then in male gay relationships, very often they are open marriages. There's actually
Hmm.
less divorce in male gay relationships than there is in heterosexual marriages. But very often those marriages are open marriages where they allow the partners to go out and have other partners as long as when you come home. And that's kind of how guys are. They're
Hmm.
very into just functionality and they don't tend to be as sensitive to the emotional needs of fidelity, commitment, and those kinds of things.
Yeah,
So just
there's there, to highlight what you were saying about the women. There's a meme that goes around that makes me chuckle. Lesbian relationships are 70 and above percent divorce, showing that it's the problems with the women, not the men. But hey, just for clarity for those listening,
the women, it's that the problems with the man very often, but it's the woman that calls
yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah. No, but for clarity's sake on this podcast, we talk about lesbian marriages and male marriages in quotes because they're not real marriages, but that's how the world describes them. Go ahead,
And
Joey.
on that point, kind of related to all this is
Yeah,
right now, the right and conservatives, right, like the conservative movement, it's very much like, I think for political expediency, people
right.
want to start downplaying some of these truths, right? In other words,
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
let's just say there are a number of Republicans in Congress and
Hmm.
the incoming administration who they have a position on these subject on like gay marriage that Barack Obama would not have run on in 2008, did not run on.
Mm-hmm.
And yet now, even though all these stats that you guys are pointing out are so true, this book has come out that's shown, the ends of the sexual revolution. And yet, because culture is so strong, right, like even the conservative party is still, like, well, maybe we can be okay with surrogacy and bringing
Mm-hmm.
children into same sex relationships. But I think the point that you were highlighting, right, is a male couple, a heterosexual couple, right? That is that blending of both traits, feminine and masculine. That's what a child needs. And so, listen, I think that in the world we live in, I'm basically pretty libertarian on how adults are going to live their lives, just because I don't think the state can realistically regulate that. But when it comes to children, right, like this is why it matters that, 20 years ago, all politicians agreed that marriage is, for a legal purpose, marriage is between a man and a woman. Because, listen, at the end of the day, when it comes to the religious aspect of marriage, that's regulated by churches. But the one aspect of marriage that actually matters to the state is children,
Children.
right?
Yep.
What are we going to do about the raising of children? And so
Mm.
I think conservatives and I think Republicans ought to read all this research that maybe they tag your congressman, have them watch this video. But we need to stand faithful.
Mhm.
Because I'm going to actually make an explicit example. This whole transgender bathroom thing that's happened at the Capitol because the guy goes by Sarah, who was elected the first transgender congressperson, and
Mhm.
Nancy Mace, the Republican congresswoman, she's made this whole big stand about how she's going to make a stand, and a man's not going to use the female restrooms in the Capitol, and like good. But then you go and you watch all of her videos explaining it, and she goes out of her way to say, "Listen, I'm a feminist, and she means generally a feminist. I'm a feminist, and I voted for gay marriage 3 times, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, so yes, I'm glad she's standing up here, but again, and this is what this conversation is about. It's like, go a little back, right? How did we get to here? This thing that you're standing up against, because otherwise, I mean, it's that meme, right? It's in Republicans of old, or Republicans or conservatives versus liberals, right? It's the just the plain rainbow flag, and then the trans like new rainbow flag, and it's like conservatives, right, reject progress and embrace tradition. It's like, what are we going to be accepting 10 years down the road if we don't get to the roots?
Yep.
I'm really sad about the Republican Party's basic sellout on abortion, but
Hmm.
I'm politically homeless. I don't identify
Yeah.
fully with either party, so I don't lose sleep over it. But yeah, it's the Overton window shifting, and they shift with it.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, well, let me read a
Yeah. Go ahead.
quote to kind of set us off here. So she's talking about the fact that certain aspects of the sexual revolution put women in great danger. Quote, if you wanted to design the perfect environment for the would-be rapist, then you couldn't do much better than a party or nightclub filled with young women who are wearing high heels, limited mobility,
Hmm.
and drinking or taking drugs, limited awareness. So, my advice to young women has to be this: avoid putting yourself in a situation where you are alone with a man you don't know, or a man who gives you a bad feeling in your gut. He is almost certainly stronger and faster than you, which means that the only thing standing between you and rape is that man's self control.
Yeah. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and I was in the world for 12 years between the ages of 15 and 27. And we used to attend nightclubs, particularly one in New York, where there were no male and female bathrooms. It was all co-ed. And the drug use and the abuse and the hookup culture was so bad that they removed the doors from the toilet stalls. So if you as a woman wanted to use the bathroom, your girlfriends had to stand in front of the stall so you can use it. And so this quote is just that. I mean, you see it. You see debauchery in those clubs, and then people wonder why they're empty inside, right? You can't be living that life and think you're going to come out fulfilled.
Well, and let me say this is someone who is involved in abuse response work.
Hmm.
I'm trying, my goal is to, along with other people, eradicate sexual abuse from my denomination.
Hmm.
And that means, appropriate reporting devices and appropriate response and appropriate prevention and all those things. So I'm involved in abuse response work, but one of the things that I've noticed is as the abuse response movement has sidled up to the Me Too movement, there have been some real imbalances that I think work against the safety of women. And this quote that I just read brings in the current culture, i.e., feminist ideals and the sexual revolution, you're not allowed to say to a woman, don't wear high heels and don't
Hmm.
get drunk and don't be with these guys and don't go out and party if you don't want to get raped, because that would be what? That would be blaming,
Yeah, yeah.
what am I going
Victim
to say?
blaming.
Blaming the victim.
Yeah.
Right. So, one of the things that I do in my workshop on abuse is I say there's a difference between victim blaming and potential victim training. Because
Hmm.
what you say to women, if you say all the blame, that they have zero, it's not about who's to blame really or
Hmm.
culpability per se, but it's about identifying the antecedents for a certain event. And if nothing that the woman did or didn't do provided any kind of antecedent for the event, then she's a helpless victim and always will be. That they get so much out of blaming the guy 100%. And I agree, when a woman is raped, it's 100% his fault, you know? And I agree with that. But is there something she can do to reduce the chances of it? Yes. And don't call that victim blaming.
Yeah.
That's
Look.
not, that's just dying on an ideological hill while you could give a rip about the safety of women. And you're just revealing your own hypocrisy, frankly.
To talk to the men who may be listening, I have studied a lot of what is called self-defense and protecting yourself when you're out on the streets. When you get in the car, lock the door immediately before you put your plug in your phone and do other things. I don't go to gas stations at night. If I have enough gas to get me home, I get home, and then the next day during the day, I fill up. The top three places where people get robbed, at least in my area, I live in the Houston area, is cell phone stores, Walmart parking lots, and gas stations. Well, I try to avoid those at night. If I have to go, I go, but I minimize. Why? Because I know the risk. So why am I going to send my daughter to Florida State University, which is one of the biggest party schools and hookup cultures? What am I exposing them to? Even if they're like, quote unquote, Daniel from the Bible, right? On the up and up. The people around her are not. And so I'm not blaming her, but I want to protect. And it's just smart. You lock your doors at night. Why? If somebody breaks in your house and hurts you, is that your fault? No. But that's why you lock the door. We're not victims. Yet when it comes to telling women what to do in order to be the safest, then it becomes, oh, you're victim blaming. No, we have to get over that and make smart decisions.
Oh, that used to just burn me to hear that kind of thing. Let's
Mm-hmm.
teach women how to make themselves safe and empower them to do what they need to do,
Mm-hmm.
make themselves safe in a world that sometimes they won't be able to make themselves safe. Sometimes the odds will be so stacked against them, no matter what they do, they're going to get hurt. But if they can minimize those events, then why not? That's
Mm-hmm.
just, to me, that's just common sense and
One more
decency.
example. One more example from self-defense. My mother comes visits us frequently. Sometimes she stays a long time. Well, Hobby Airport, that area on the way to Hobby Airport, it's one of the most dangerous places, which is why I don't book a flight for her to return early in the morning or late at night. I go pick her up in the middle of the day. I don't care if there's traffic. Why? Because you have to do the smart things to avoid. Now, sometimes I have flown in the morning. If I can't help it, I can't help it. But when I can help it, I'm making decisions ahead of time, and women need to do the same thing.
Another issue that factors into this discussion is modesty. So it used to be in Christian circles that women would be blamed, for rape,
Mm,
because what were you wearing was the first
yeah.
question that was asked. And that's one extreme. I mean, come
Hmm.
on. Rape is a violent act, and I don't care if you're walking around naked, it's still the violent person's fault, and
Hmm.
they're the ones that aggressed on you and not the other way around. And one of the things, yeah, one of the features of, for example, um, Islamic cultures where women have to wear these burqas is the belief that men are incapable of resisting
Hmm.
sexual urges if they see the female face and form. That's a fallacy. That's a
Yeah.
theological error. Men are capable, but is there an influence, and do certain ways of presenting ourselves as women beckon the eyes of men, a fair percentage of which will be creepy men?
Hmm.
Yes. The answer to that is yes. So no, you would be able to defend yourself if you were dressed immodestly and you got raped. You would be able to defend yourself. Nobody would blame you, and you'd win a court case. But do you want to beckon the eyes of these men? That's the question that you need to ask yourself honestly. And if you don't want to beckon the eyes of these men, then dress in a way that they look somewhere else for thrills.
Hmm. Hmm.
You got me on a little bit of a soapbox here, so I'll tell you another
No,
thing
no.
that
Go ahead. Go ahead.
is the same group that says women can wear whatever they want, just no, don't even mention modesty. That is verboten. Will also say that you can't bounce your eyes. Men cannot bounce their eyes. Now, when I first read bounce your eyes, I didn't know what it was. It turns out what it is you just move your eyes somewhere else. So if you're
Hmm.
talking to a woman, you're a man, and the science is overwhelming that men are very visually stimulated, that
Hmm.
men tend to focused on body parts versus emotions. And there's just some crucial differences, and we as women may not pick them up. So if a man is talking to a woman and maybe she has a plunging neckline or something else is going on, if it's tempting to him, and it's true, she's a free moral agent, she can choose to wear what she wishes to wear, but if it's tempting to him and only he knows his sexual background, his limits, what his weak points are, then he just simply moves his eyes somewhere else and he can continue to carry on the conversation with her. He doesn't have to look right at her. Well, that was considered
Aggression.
disrespectful.
A
And many,
microaggression.
yes. Now, here's the thing is put those two things together. Women can wear whatever they want and men are not allowed to look away. I'm sorry, but that's entrapment.
I'm glad you're saying it because I've had some of these thoughts and I share them with people in private, right? But in public social media, those are wars I'm not looking to fight. But I'm more vocal about them now because I have 3 daughters, right? And I have to teach them, and we age appropriate, but we teach them things and stuff. And it's true with women. With 3 daughters, I have to be more vocal about it.
And listen, if I have enough self respect, if a guy doesn't give me enough sort of micro cues of affirmation while I'm having a conversation with him, it's up to me to draw upon the strength of God and maintain my confidence in that conversation. If I have something to
Hmm.
say and he has something to say, I'm not going to be so dependent on him giving me visual and oral cues and auditory cues that he's listening to me that I'm going to fall apart if he has to avert his eyes. I'm not going to take it personally. Maybe he's got a real battle on his hands. Maybe
Mm.
he's just now overcoming sexual addiction, years and years of sexual addiction. It's just an overwhelming struggle for him, and he can't look straight at any woman, even at my
Mm.
age. He can't deal with it. I'm going to be like, he's got to do what he's got to do. It's a free world,
Yeah,
and
let
let him
them.
figure it
And I would say, so the conversation we're having about like modesty and what choices the woman makes, and we're having that now in the context of like an actual like violent assault, rape.
Hmm.
But that's the worst case scenario where it's clear cut. But where I think the decisions actually come more into play is, I don't know if you're familiar with the case of the actor Aziz Ansari, but he was an actor. He's an actor, a comedian, and a while ago he got caught up in a Me Too scandal. A woman, came and accused him of a bunch of stuff. Well, when the story actually came out, he didn't rape her at all, right? Basically, the two had had a date, like a bad date, whatever. They went back. I don't know if it's his place or her place. They hooked up, and then the next day she regretted the decision, and so then she said, "Oh, this is rape." And that's where I think the choices actually come and matter because yes, both of those people acted wrongly and badly, but there wasn't, you can't actually, I don't think a fair minded person could say that's assault or that's
Hmm.
rape. That's 2 people, 2 adults making a bad decision and regretting it. And so that's where I think the modesty conversation and stuff is more applicable because I agree with you. The modesty question actually doesn't matter if we're
out.
talking about actual rape because that's
Hmm.
that's an actual violent act that's chosen and whatever. But it matters in these other cases that are also very common.
Okay, so since you mentioned that, there's about a 10% greater chance if a woman physically fights a sexual assault that she will be injured. There's a greater chance she'll be
Hmm.
injured. It's a little, not a big chance, because most guys are just looking for an easy time of it. Most sexual aggressors just want an
Hmm.
easy target. So she pushes back, he's probably going to run. But in some cases, he'll fight and she'll get injured. But there's a 50% chance if she fights that she will not get raped. So it's kind of a pick your poison dilemma. You want to get hurt, or do you want to just submit to what's happening and probably not get hurt but get raped? And I would argue that's a toss up because there's a lot of trauma bound up in being raped. And so I think it would be good to train women to fight, even if they don't win the fight,
Well, I
to
got the
train them.
book for you.
Yeah.
Seriously, I got the book for you, and I read it. It's called "When Violence Is Necessary." And it's
Hmm.
an awesome book because anybody could read it because it's not just about a rape thing. But I'll tell you a perfect story real quick.
Mhm.
Let me sum it up.
Mhm.
2 women. One was a security guard no, a park ranger in a national park. The other one was just a young lady college. Long story short, the one who was the park ranger refused to act decisively. So when her rapist, who had her hostage, was sleeping and she was already kind of injured, she decided to flee and try to run away from him. And he caught her and ended up killing her. Where she had the opportunity to basically stick a knife through his temple and live. The other young lady was in a college campus, second floor, so she left the window open thinking she was safe. Well, by the time she wakes up, there's a man on top of her. So instead of fighting, she took her training and relaxed. So he then thought, okay, she's game. She's not going to fight me. At the appropriate time, she wrapped her legs around him, grabbed him by the neck, and shoved her nail right through his eyes, flipped him over, because at that point he's in pain, flipped him over, and by God's grace, he landed on the table below his neck, broke his neck, and she lived. But regardless, right, this book advocates that violence is the 1,000 least resort. Try to avoid it. However, when it's time to go, it's time to go. And it's time to be decisive. And I think every woman would benefit from this because it teaches you, first of all, how to prevent the situations. Then last of all, how to fight. Had that woman, the park ranger, fought, she'd be alive today.
Those are great stories. Go ahead. Sorry.
I'll just plug here as a big 2A fan. I do believe that the Second Amendment is the great equalizer, and these biological differences that we talk about between men and women.
Yeah.
Listen, a bullet, will take down a predator. The only thing I would say is if, women, I do encourage women to carry, but make sure you're going to the range, make sure you're training and you know how to use what you're carrying.
That's interesting. I've never heard a gun presented as the great equalizer, but I think you have a point there.
Oh, yeah. I mean, one thing that's sad about being armed is that it prevents about close to anywhere, the numbers say between 500,000 to 2 million violent crimes a year. But it's not reported because media hates the 2A movement. Actually, the book is called When Violence is the Answer by Tim Larkin. Highly recommend it. Because it really, sorry to cut you off, it really teaches you how to avoid it the majority of the time. But then when it's time to move, it's time to move. Go ahead.
And here's another benefit of fighting a sexual assault is there will be injuries, there will be scratches, there will be blood.
DNA.
And you'll have a better chance of proving that it was non-consensual. And this is exactly what Hebrew law did. If a woman was assaulted in the country, they believed the woman because there was no one there to hear her. But if she was assaulted in a city, she would have to cry. She was required to cry out in order to create a defense for sexual assault, that she resisted sexual assault because there was an easy way out. And so there were evidences that there had been a fight. And I think even the woman that came in from the country, there would be evidences of a struggle, not to mention, hymen breakage and blood and so forth. Yeah. So I'm all for. Do you do self-defense classes, Gio? Maybe you should do one online.
No, I do not, but I study it. I've read numerous books, 10 books. Here's why, and I've never said this publicly, but we moved into the forest here, and my wife, I grew up in New York City, so we don't have weapons. But my wife, being a country girl, her father had weapons, and we have a hog problem in our forest. And so she was like, get one when we moved to the property. But I was like, I'm not going to wait till we move to the property. I need to get one now so I can practice and stuff. But then I was very scared of owning a weapon because I've never owned one and I have kids. But man, I read so many books and I've trained my kids not to use it, but this is a safe, don't touch it, yada, yada. And I feel more confident in the ability to protect my family now mainly because I know what to look for, what the yellow, they use a system, right? Yellow light, green light, red light. And the green light is trouble, right? You're not paying attention to your surroundings. You leave the car door open, you leave your house door open. We need to live in a yellow light where you are situationally aware. And living that way has been such a blessing because you see things coming from a mile away.
And this is part of your responsibility as a man, which leads us to
Yeah.
our next point, because I've
Okay,
got
go
a
ahead.
quote about chivalry. But it is your responsibility as a man, and I stand on that. I think men have protective impulses, and I think they have greater strength and just aggression and the ability to attack, beyond what women
Hmm.
have. And therefore, they are called in a dangerous world to protect the more vulnerable and the weaker. So she says something amazing about chivalry here. She says the word chivalry is now deeply unfashionable, but it describes something of what I'm calling for: chivalrous codes that encourage male protectiveness toward women are routinely read from an egalitarian perspective as condescending and sexist. But the cross culturally well documented greater male physical strength and propensity for violence makes such codes of chivalry overwhelmingly advantageous to women, and their abolition in the man
In the name.
in the name of feminism deeply unwise. I don't know if you saw me going back and forth a little bit this morning on Twitter, Joey, with this guy that didn't want, I don't know, it was about male female roles
Hmm.
and men versus women in marriage. And there's just this effort to flatten the sexes, and it is just so unwise.
Yeah.
We
One
live,
example.
yeah,
Sorry.
go ahead.
One example I like to use that makes sense and it makes people chuckle, but it's this. Ready? Imagine somebody's breaking into my house and I got three girls and a wife. And we have a 3-year-old. And I tell to my wife, hand me the 3-year-old and go find out what's happening. Everybody, even the feminists, will look at me like, you idiot. Like, what are
Terrible
you
person.
doing? Even the craziest feminists would say that's something wrong with that, right? Because we do have roles, and I want to man my role proudly, right? If somebody's breaking in, my first thing is secure my girls where they are, and then I go explore what's going on, right? And
Right.
so,
Please.
I don't know if you guys have seen the video that goes around. It's like a sketch that goes around Facebook and stuff all the time, and it's this couple in the sketch. They're going out to eat, and the waiter. I forget exactly all the things, but this that basically the waiter, when it comes time for the check and everything, says, "Is it going to be one check or two check?" And the woman's getting ready to answer one, and then the guy's like, "No, it's two checks." And how dare you assume that it would be one check? I'm a male ally, blah, blah. And she's like, that's what she would want because she's a feminist. And then the woman's like, yeah, yeah, okay, fine. And then they go to the next thing. And it's like, I forget, but basically goes down to all these things, and he ends with like the woman is like, or the table's being mugged, and the guy gets behind the woman and like fights her, and then the mugger is like eventually like apologizes to the woman and like, hey, here's my number, because this guy is a joke. So like
Yeah.
even the feminists realize at the end of the day they don't want a guy who's just going to be a pushover and not going to dig into the roles. But
Yeah.
along with what you were saying about chivalry, there was a question I had written down. I wanted to get your perspectives on. And so, like, when we talk about the chivalry code, we talk about gender roles, and obviously, I think there's a sense where that can be too rigid, and maybe that's part of what's being reacted against.
mhm.
But the idea that there are some kind of gender roles, or the idea that, and this is one of the things I went into the book, is that the sexual revolution, right, posited freedom, right? So it's freedom from chivalry, freedom from restrictive gender roles, freedom from all these things. And yet, at least it appears what I was saying is that it actually didn't deliver freedom. And I was wondering, did you get that? Did you get that perspective? And like, how did you see the freedom aspect of it?
Yeah, well, I like to say, 1 in 3 women are beaten, raped, or coerced into sex in the world, are beaten, raped, or coerced into sex at some point in their lifetime. And most of that damage is done By who? Men.
Mm-hmm.
What chance do women have of being protected from being beaten, raped, or coerced into sex? Also men. So
Mm-hmm.
we don't need to cancel men. We need more good men because it's
Mm-hmm.
good men that protect women against bad men. And that's just a fact of life. And I'm sorry, I wish the world was really completely safe for women, but it just isn't. Women are
Mm-hmm.
smaller, they're weaker, and really in the West we're kind of delusional about how egalitarian the world really isn't. You go into the developing world and you see the incredible gap between male power and female power and why you need protective men in the
Mm-hmm.
mix. So yes, this ban on chivalry and the flattening of sex roles is just wrong-headed, but ultimately, well, what Louise Perry brings out is it delivers women to very unsafe circumstances and they end up being raped more rather than raped less. Now, I do want to give a little bit of space, a little grace to
Mm-hmm.
feminists who push back against protectiveness simply because sometimes protectiveness it can morph into control.
Mm-hmm.
I've even experienced this in my male relationships with my dad, my husband, my brothers. I think all of the men in my life have wanted to protect me at various times, but then they also have to hold their carnal nature in check and not do it in such a way that it feels like they're crossing my free will
Mm-hmm.
and that they're managing me or belittling me in some way. And so I will grant that to feminists who push back against protectivism, and that is that sometimes jealous, possessive husbands, for example,
Mm-hmm.
will claim pretty much straight across the board that they're just trying to protect her, but actually they're
Controlling.
becoming in the process of protecting her, they're becoming someone from whom she needs to be protected.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to be careful about that. And at the same time, we need more men that are willing to protect women. And I'm, for one, not at all happy about canceling men. It's been a real mistake.
One of the lessons that I learned on being protective of women, even women you don't know, was actually taught to me by my best friend, and not verbally. We were, this was when I was in the world, we were at a house party, and he noticed a guy being wrong with a girl. And I had never seen him like this before, but he walked across the room like he was possessed and just grabbed the man by the neck, pinned him up against the wall, and I for a second thought, oh, he knows the girl. And turned out he didn't know her and she didn't know him, and we
Wow.
then became friends. But I was like, yeah, man, that's how to do it. And so from that point on, we were like that at places. You don't see it often, at least not in the places we did. But he
Mhm.
taught me that early on, and I was like, yeah, I can dig that.
And I think personally that that's where the verses in the Bible on wives submitting to their husbands
Mm-hmm.
are coming from. I think that submission is an act of trust to someone who loves you and has your best interest in mind and has a character record of
Mm-hmm.
defending you and protecting you and
Mm-hmm.
being about your best good. And once that's established in a relationship, which whenever you see anything about wives submitting, you always see something about husbands loving. So it's a system, it's
Mm-hmm.
a duet, not a
Yeah.
solo. And so that system where the man protects, there's a certain amount of trust that's established in that, and she can submit in that context. And so I think that's a beautiful thing. I don't think submission is so much losing your individuality to your
Yeah.
husband. Other inspired statements that counter that whole idea.
No, no,
And
and I love it. So you can bring it up here. We're not opposed. I love that statement of hers, where you're
and
not to lose your independence to your husband.
well, we talked about Ellen White. She,
Mm-hmm.
I think, intuited that the submission verses would be used as clobber verses on women and
Mm-hmm.
to control them. And I think she intuited that the Christian church would take it to a place that God never intended. And there is quite a massive,
Mm-hmm.
abuse of those verses that has gone on, not so much in Adventism. I mean, there are
Mm-hmm.
pockets in
Yeah.
Adventism. Adventists overall are more egalitarian for the simple reason that we have this female prophet sitting in the middle of all of our board meetings, so to speak. It really does check some of the things that go on in fundamentalist Protestantism. And there is this sort of history that Protestantism has, conservative Protestantism, of putting husbands in a role where they are basically autocrats in their families. And Ellen White apparently intuiting that would happen. She was a smart lady, she knew human nature, issued a few significant, serious diatribes,
Salvos. Yeah.
domineering husbands. And there's some
I
really great, yeah,
When I
to
met my
that.
wife, we met online and we were asking each other open-ended questions. And one of the open-ended questions I asked her was, what do you think of the verse that says, wives submit to your husband? Right? Because I, in my role as a minister, had seen too many women take that to mean they were to be doormats. And one of my favorite phrases that I like to say to people I'm counseling for marriage is, you don't want to finish raising your spouse, right? You want to marry an equal. And so I needed her to answer that question to understand where her Christian maturity was. And she answered it flawlessly. I found out later, though, that she had never thought she'd marry a Hispanic because her only Hispanic, that she had around her were these male chauvinists. And so she was like, uh-oh, where's he coming from with this? And so it was good for us to understand what that properly means. And so, yeah, people.
She probably thought you meant, like, are you going to be a submissive wife?
Yeah, exactly.
She probably thought this could be the end of things.
Yeah,
But
exactly. Yeah, but I had to ask because like I
yeah.
tell people, you don't want to be raising children and your spouse.
And one of the things I've noticed about marriage in which one of the two spouses dominates the other, and it can go either way, it can be the
Mm-hmm.
husband or the wife. But in the sort of evangelical world, it's been sort of systematized to be the husband, and that's thought to be very virtuous to have a husband
Mm-hmm.
that's always calling the shots. And one of the things I've noticed in marriages like that is that they do infantilize the submitter,
Mm-hmm.
and the, the person dominating becomes kind of a parent. And the
Yeah.
first thing that goes out the window when you have a parent-child relationship in a marriage is sexual attraction.
Mm.
Because how can you be
Yeah, I know.
romantic with your own child
Yeah.
or your parent, you
Mm-hmm.
know?
Yeah.
So it
You know
doesn't work
what?
out.
One of my
Yeah.
friends said it best about that verse. He said, "Ladies, wouldn't you want to be submissive if your husband is acting like Jesus?" Right? So he doesn't excuse the men, right? They have to be acting like Jesus. But if that's
That's
the
right.
case, then why wouldn't you want to be submissive?
That's right.
And so that's that balance. I always remember that. What else on this article you wanted to
Oh,
point
I
out?
loved it. So one of the things she talks about is she uses the phraseology disenchanting sex and sort of physicalizing it, making
Mm-hmm.
it no different than any other activity, physical act. It's about as meaningful and as emotionally and spiritually relevant and important as moving your bowels. It just
Mm-hmm.
is disenchanted. It has no layers of meaning. And here's a quote. She says, today's young women are typically unaware that men are, in general, much better suited to emotionless sex,
Mm-hmm.
and it's much easier to regard their sexual partners as disposable. Ignorant of this fact, women can all too easily fail to recognize that being desired is not at all the same thing as being held in high esteem. Now, she's just so good at nailing
Mm-hmm.
things down, so articulate. But take the first half of that. Um, Men are better at emotionless sex. This is a fact. I read a study where they took two different kinds of images and put them in front of males and females.
Mm-hmm.
They took images of, like, very graphic images of sex, like just organs, sexual
Mm-hmm.
organs, erect penises and boobs, and just like
Mm-hmm.
really
Yeah.
graphic. And then they also took images that involved a narrative. That involved, like, instead of just Juan's body parts, they'd show Juan standing at the door with no shirt on and tight jeans, but you kind of have this sense that
Mm-hmm.
there's a story to it.
Yeah.
And they measured the sexual responsiveness, and they can do it by literally putting a, a meter on a body part to
Yeah.
measure
Yeah.
how physical activity there is. And that's
Mm-hmm.
how much detail I'm going to go into here. But
Arousal. Yeah.
they can measure arousal with
Mm-hmm.
various machines on men and women. And
Mm-hmm.
so they measured the arousal level, and men were more often aroused by the graphic images. I'm
Mm-hmm.
sorry, guys. I don't
Mm-hmm.
mean this to insult you, but it's just
No, no. But
reality.
look, no, but if it's grounded in Christ, then it's a reality. Like I find my wife extremely attractive, right? And so, we have, we play with each other. Let's just put it that way, right? Or, and I'm talking about in the kitchen, right? I may squeeze her here and there, right? Because
Yeah,
it's just that's
just how
how we
God.
are, right? And
Yeah,
obviously it's grounded in her, but that when people let go of their that reality, then that's where it gets abusive, right? When you start going beyond the boundaries of marriage, it gets
yeah,
abusive and detrimental to self.
and marriages need the wife's influence to help
Mm-hmm.
refine the man because women have a harder time dismantling sex from emotional connection. And that's a good quality that women have that actually
Mm-hmm.
elevates them and elevates the man ultimately. So in the party culture, men can just bang a woman and walk away and really not suffer emotionally
Mm-hmm.
or have any kind of trauma response to that. And guess what? She's not going to be able to walk away that easily without lasting emotional
Mm-hmm.
damage.
Mm-hmm.
And so, how unfair is hookup culture, again, to women? How well is feminism working out for women? Not
Mm-hmm.
well at all, in that it lies about the basic sex differences that set women up for being more vulnerable in a relational context.
I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and I remember there was a song by a group called Lisa Lisa and the Cult Jam. And the song was like, the lyric said, I wonder if I take you home, implying intimacy. Will you be there tomorrow? Right? That was the struggle of the song. I wonder if I take you home, will you be there tomorrow? Fast forward to like the 2000s, there was this song from a group, I forget the name of the group, but it was basically, why are you taking so long to unbutton my pants? Right? And you see in a shift of 2 decades how it went from protecting that intimacy to the hookup culture attitude. And it's been a nightmare for people emotionally.
And women becoming more and more aggressive. One of the things that Louise
Mm-hmm.
Perry brings out is that women are told that they have to have sex like a man has sex, like it can just have a gratuitous, casual sexual encounter and
Mm-hmm.
they can walk away, emotionally detached from it. And various television shows kind of,
Sex in the
celebrate,
City.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
celebrated that. And
which
it's
was
just
written by gay men.
why.
Oh, I
What'd you
didn't know
say, Jeff?
that. I know.
But the writers of Sex and the City were gay men, and it was just something that I heard someone comment on one time. Where it's actually Andrew Clavin, and one of the things he was talking about, he's like, he was talking about the sexual revolution and all this stuff. And then when he said he looked in, who are the writers of the show, and it was gay men, he's like, oh, that makes sense because these women on the show are gay men. I mean, they're women, they're playing the character, but the whole way in which they are interacting, it's this is how
Mm-hmm.
this is gay male culture.
Yeah, the
And so
promiscuity.
Such a lie.
Mm-hmm.
one,
Such a lie. And then she goes into pornography. Um, Pornography harms everyone, she points out, and models dangerous and abusive patterns. And she brings out a lot in the book about how much of pornography these days is BDSM. We should probably
Mm.
define that,
Yeah.
distasteful as it is to do so. Bondage, what is it? Bondage, BDSM, sadomasochism, bondage
Yeah.
discipline, sadomasochism is a kind of sex where individuals form contracts with each other. One of them is the dominant person, the other is the submitter. And I can't remember, they have language for it. I don't remember the names, but they have this contract that one of them will submit, one will dominate, and they basically inflict pain on the other and engage in sadomasochism. And that is thought to be some kind of thrill. But what ends up happening in cases like that is people develop an appetite for those things. They form an association, a la classical conditioning, where you get exposed to a stimuli and you have a certain positive response or a certain pleasurable event associated with the certain stimuli, and you're going to come to experience that pleasure when you see that negative stimuli. So they used to use this kind of thing in military, where uh, they would give soldiers certain pleasures, wine and women or whatever they would give them, but they would first show violence to them, and that would create an association in their mind. That's called classical conditioning. And so that's basically what's going on with with BDSM pornography, is people are forming an association between sexual arousal and violence. And interestingly enough, that is not how the human brain is according to God's design. There's an inverse relationship, but you can bypass our natural kind of DNA and design and develop these really perverted appetites. So obviously that's going to disserve women, because women end up being the submitters the vast majority of the time. But that, in my, this is not part of my world, never has been, but apparently that's the kind of pornography that people are turning to in this day and age.
Well, I mean, I think the Solomon principle that pleasures die with overuse, right? And so then you need a bigger high and a bigger high, and they're looking for more and more pleasure. It becomes degrading. And that's what it's happening with the hookup culture. It's they're not satisfied anymore, and they're looking for something. And so then they, on these campuses in A&M, they're mixing alcohol and sex, and then they're mixing drugs and sex, and it becomes a degrading endeavor.
Very interesting that the Bible says that at God's right hand are pleasures forevermore, lasting pleasure. Research has been done on casual sexual encounters versus sex within a bonded relationship, where there are higher levels of oxytocin. And when you have that bonded sex, you actually experience more dopamine response in that context. So in other words, having a legitimate bond in a sexual encounter is going to heighten your pleasure. But what happens with these casual sexual encounters is that there isn't as much pleasure. It's like the Rolling Stones song, I can't get no satisfaction. It doesn't really bring that sense of satisfaction on multiple levels, biochemical, neurological. There's all kinds of stuff going on that God has orchestrated in human nature. And you don't get that benefit when you're having sex outside of his design. And so it sets up a craving, kind of a dissatisfaction and a craving. And the first thing we think when we didn't get satisfaction is, if I just get more. If I
Yes,
just,
exactly.
and so it leads very quickly to sexual addiction. Now, it's not that married couples can't experience sexual addiction. You can, even in the context of a marriage. But for the most part, married sex ends up sort of self-regulating and being reasonable. And then sex outside of God's design ends up becoming addictive very quickly. Yeah.
I didn't realize this conversation is going so good. I gotta skedaddle here in a few minutes. Go ahead, Joey.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, so for me, I feel like the underlying conversation of the whole book and the whole topic of the sexual revolution is a conversation relating to freedom. And like we're Americans here, right? What does the meme say? It's like the British novelist says, I will die for honor. The French novelist says, I will die for love. And the Russian novelist just says, I will die. And the American novelist says, I will die for freedom. Right. So like we're Americans, right? Really, this is a world that America has built in a lot of ways. And so freedom's the number one conversation. And like, don't get me wrong. Like I'm the guy with the American flag out in the middle of the street in a hurricane. Right? Like freedom is a good thing. But I think a lot of these things are perversions of freedom, right? In other words, they promise freedom. That's one thing that Perry kept saying is the sexual revolution promised freedom. and yet it delivered something else.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mhm.
obviously there's the, we've talked a lot about like the sexual assault, and like that's one extreme, but even some of the stuff that we're talking about that's not to that extreme, it's also a violation of freedom, right? Because again, I'll go to my guy Andrew Clavin, and he said he'd read these articles, right, in these fancy, the New Yorker or the Atlantic, by these women, these liberal leftist women, and they're writing about something that they don't want to do, but the way they're writing from the paper is like, does it make me sexist or does it make me anti-feminist to say I don't want to do this? And the point is like, it was supposed to promise liberty, and yet now you become a slave. It's what the Bible says, right? You become
Mm-hmm.
a slave to what you serve. Um,
Mhm.
and kind of something I've been thinking about a lot is, obviously we're Adventists here, so we care a lot about Bible prophecy. Um,
Mhm.
and religious liberty is something that we talk about a lot, right? And that's in the broader context of liberty.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we stand for America's constitutional system. But I
Mhm.
think a lot of times as Adventists and like a religious liberty people, we've looked at like threats to religious liberty that are going to come from overarching government, right? It's tyrannical government looking to control. And then I think, like, no, like that's not what it is. It's like, if you look at the American society after 50 years of these kinds of radical revolutions, and what other kind of government is fit to govern American society, right? When you have men who haven't been trained in sexual virtue and stuff, you have women who have been conditioned to think that going against their natural impulses or whatever and being liberated is what is. So it's like you've got broken sexual dynamics, which equal broken family dynamics, which equal
Mhm.
broken economic dynamics. And so when a government comes and says, hey, it's time to get back to God, it's time, you people can't be self governed, you can't be a republic. And so we need religious order now, right? And like, so in other words, the people lost their ability to self govern. I don't know. This is kind of half
Yeah,
baked a
that
little
that's
bit.
a topic for a different day. Dr. Jennifer, wrap us up.
Yeah,
What would
I
you
love
say?
your mind, Joey. I love your mind. You know a
Mm-hmm.
lot. You know a lot more about politics and government than I do, and I'm always fascinated by your tweets. Okay, so I want to just kind of mourn a little bit in closing
Mm-hmm.
because unfortunately, Louise Perry does not land where everything would have her land, which is that the Bible, it turns out, is true. I'm
Mm-hmm.
experiencing some of the same frustration with Jordan Peterson, who's written this
Good.
book, We Who Wrestle with God, and he isn't really a believer. I mean, that's the bottom line, is he still hasn't
Mm-hmm.
come to faith yet. He was asked, I watched an interview with Piers Morgan, and Piers is a Catholic, and he just puts it to him, and he just starts talking. Peterson talks, you know.
Yeah. Word
And
salads.
it's frustrating to me that these people who, like you said, they get to the top of the mountain and the theologian is already there, but then they don't say,
Mm-hmm.
"Well, what do you have to tell me, theologian?"
Yeah.
And I wish they would. So she sort of distances herself from what she calls traditionalism and says it doesn't solve the problem. And she calls it. She says she rejects the snobbery of progressivism, but she's not going to resort to basically the Bible
Mm-hmm.
teaching. And that's disappointing to me because that's where I think what God does is he gives us shortcuts. He says, do this, this will be better for you. And because we love him and we trust him, we follow even though we don't fully understand. And then there's these few human beings that have this tremendous ability to look at the grand sweep of history and sort of draw lessons in their own personal experience. And they have trial and error and maybe scientific research or researching history, and they come to certain conclusions that are biblical conclusions. But God would like to give us all that shortcut because we're not all that intelligent to be able to figure those out. and
Yeah.
and ultimately, I just wish it all landed at Jesus. But hopefully, with time, she'll get there.
I like to
And really,
say,
yeah.
I like to tell people that Frank Sinatra had it wrong. Where he's saying, I did it my way. If people
Mhm.
learn to do it God's way, everything will go better. Dr. Jennifer, thank you very much for hopping
So much
on with us on short notice.
fun.
Um, you know, I enjoyed this conversation deeply because I've seen it. I've seen the trauma of this hookup culture on people. From my position as a minister of God. And it's sad because it could all be avoided had they just followed the word of God. All right. Until next time on the Gio and Joey show, be blessed. Once again, Dr. Jenniffer, thank you very much.